Let's start with a bit of a shocker. What if the intellectual life of the so-called Dark Ages was, in fact, a vibrant, optimistic, and highly rational laboratory?
A laboratory that laid the very foundation for modernity.
Right. And what if that huge intellectual split we see today, the one between faith and science, was actually caused by a messy historical divorce and not some ancient inevitable feud?
That is the counterintuitive claim at the absolute heart of Richard D. Rubenstein's Aristotle's Children. It's a work that really seeks to completely overturn that old caricature of the Middle Ages.
And we want you to enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
It's more than just a summary, although we do include that, of course.
This feature examines how the author shapes an argument, how they build influence, and
crucially, how they earn or maybe lose your trust.
it's all about giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and, well, greater discernment. So, should you read this book? This conversation should help. It's also excellent for aspiring writers.
And if you find this expanded format valuable, we would love to hear from you. Your feedback really does help guide our future content.
And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
So Rubenstein's mission here is to rehabilitate the Middle Ages as this period of profound philosophical creativity, not just some holding pattern between Rome and the Renaissance.
So the core thesis, it's straightforward, but also pretty profound.
It is. He's arguing that the medieval recovery of Aristotle's works,
Which was primarily facilitated by Muslim and Jewish thinkers, let's not forget.
absolutely, that this recovery created a distinctive and really a powerful marriage of faith and reason. And this synthesis is what ultimately birthed the entire modern West.
It's so important to remember the context here. The book was published in 2003.
Right, so it's intervening directly in contemporary culture wars.
And the popular narratives that were constantly casting medieval Christianity as irrational, as anti-scientific.
Exactly. So rehabilitating this complex tradition we call scholasticism is, in itself, a powerful rhetorical argument against those modern reductionist readings.
Okay, so if he's challenging popular narratives, we have to look at the author himself. Rubenstein's background is, well, it's fascinating. He's a conflict resolution scholar.
Right, and he's written widely on religious and political violence.
So how does that shape his historical approach?
It really changes everything. His professional ethos is that of a mediator, a historian of conflict, not just a technical specialist in medieval philosophy.
So he sees these arguments differently.
He treats complex scholastic debates, arguments over universals or the nature of God's knowledge as structured conflicts. He's essentially using these historical models to show us how we might conduct better public arguments today.
That makes perfect sense. And he strategically builds trust with you, the reader, by avoiding that stale stock church versus science melodrama from the very beginning.
He doesn't let the history get reduced to that simple battle at all.
But the most important element for his moral alignment, what is it?
It's his rigorous insistence that this philosophical revolution was a genuinely cooperative, interfaith project. He repeatedly credits Muslim and Jewish thinkers, Avicenna, Averroes, Maimonides, as indispensable.
Indispensable transmitters, translators, interpreter.
All of it. This emphasis aligns him with interfaith respect, with cosmopolitanism, positioning him as a narrator committed to pluralism.
So the implied audience is someone historically curious, probably skeptical of the whole science versus religion mythology.
And open to seeing medieval churchmen, Jewish scholars, and Muslim philosophers as partners in a shared rational inquiry. Rubenstein is defending the possibility of a real partnership between faith and reason.
Okay, let's unpack the substance, because the rhetoric only works if the history itself is gripping.
And Rubenstein knows that intellectual history can sound a bit dense. So his use of emotional appeal pathos is highly strategic.
He hooks you immediately. He leads with these dramatic, character-centered scenes. We see riots, professors facing heresy trials.
Tense university debates. It instantly dispels any notion that this was all dry or abstract. It makes you understand that people were staking their careers, sometimes their lives, on these philosophical questions.
But he also uses pathos to establish an argument about loss.
A sense of philosophical loss, yes. He constantly contrasts the confident, optimistic, Aristotelian view of human reason.
The idea that the universe is intelligible and our minds can grasp it.
Precisely. He contrasts that with the much darker, more suspicious views of later figures. Specifically, Martin Luther, who was deeply suspicious of reason, and Thomas Hobbes, whose view of human nature was so cynical.
So we, the readers, are invited to feel a sense of tragedy, a loss of that original, more hopeful view of human nature.
The very view the scholastics had fostered.
So what does this optimistic view actually mean logically? Let's look at the logos, the causal story he's building.
He explains the power of the Aristotelian method in very clear, accessible terms. He shows just how revolutionary Aristotle was for thinkers who were primarily steeped in, well, Neoplatonism.
A tradition that could be very mystical, sometimes even world-denying.
Right. And Aristotle gave them tools. Empirical observation, cause and effect reasoning, the systematic classification of reality. These were the logical building blocks they could now apply everywhere.
Not just to the natural world, but to theology itself.
And that is the core change. The causal chain Rubenstein traces is elegant. Aristotle's rehabilitation changed how Europeans thought about nature and causality.
That shift then enabled new forms of inquiry, what we now call scholasticism.
And that new method then led to revolutionary developments in theology, science, and politics.
And the tragic part of the argument.
The tragic conclusion is that the later dramatic rejections of this synthesis, this philosophical divorce, helped produce the modern tensions between secular and religious worldviews that we're still grappling with today.
He suggests we broke something truly valuable.
And his narrative strategy is key here. He completely avoids dry doctrinal analysis. Instead, he uses these character-centered narratives. He introduces us to figures like Albert the Great,
Who championed Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, who tried to integrate him completely.
and also figures like Siger of Brabant, who explored the uncomfortable parts of Aristotle, the bits that conflicted with dogma.
This strategy makes complex ideas feel like lived responses to intense institutional and political pressures.
We watch these intellectual heroes wrestle with the question, how do you reconcile divine revelation with human reason?
And that whole wrestling match is captured in his central, recurring metaphor,
The marriage of faith and reason?
with Aquinas cast as the patient marriage counselor, trying to make it all work.
It's a powerful metaphor because it simplifies a vast, complex history into stages we understand intuitively. Courtship, marriage, conflict, and finally, separation.
It makes the stakes emotionally legible.
It does. But the turning point, the beginning of the end for this partnership, is often attributed to William of Ockham.
Rubenstein casts him as the judge who grants the devastating divorce.
And we can't just use the metaphor without discussing the philosophical friction that caused that split.
This is where critical discernment is so important.
Occam's revolutionary idea, nominalism, was part of it. But more critically, he emphasized God's absolute freedom and power, what we call voluntarism.
Meaning, if God's will is absolutely free, then human reason can't possibly limit or fully understand him through neat Aristotelian categories.
Exactly. Occam's argument suggested that using logic to prove God's existence was maybe futile, or even an insult to divine power. This separated faith and reason, putting them on two distinct tracks.
Reason could study the physical world, but faith was for revelation, for the inscrutable will of God.
And that separation meant the physical world was no longer necessarily a reflection of divine logical structure. It was just how God happened to organize it. This created space for science, but it fractured the unified vision Aquinas had built.
That kind of structural storytelling is exactly why we find this sort of analysis so valuable. It shows you the scaffolding behind the argument.
And if you find this expanded analysis of how authors build their arguments helpful, a quick reminder from us.
Our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments, offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Shifting back to Rubenstein's persuasive strategies, he relies heavily on what you could call comparative juxtaposition.
He helps you appreciate why Aristotelianism felt so revolutionary by contrasting it so sharply with what came before.
Right, we mentioned Neoplatonism, which was pessimistic about the material world. Rubenstein puts that next to Aristotle's sheer confidence in the intelligibility and shrilly the goodness of the natural order.
The belief that you could learn about God by studying his creation.
He also uses a powerful contrast between the open-ended nature of scholastic debate and some later, more rigid systems. He talks about the scholastics' willingness to engage in double-truth experiments.
Trying to see if a philosophical truth could contradict a theological one, and just holding that tension.
Exactly. And he juxtaposes that generative tension with the later, often more absolute Protestant and secular rejections of the synthesis.
It's a subtle move, but it nudges you to see the medieval integrative project as perhaps more intellectually generous than some of our modern polarized alternatives.
For the non-specialist, the book is incredibly effective. It absolutely destroys the old caricature of the Middle Ages.
It dramatizes the complexity of the faith-reason relationship and the emphasis on interfaith transmission.
And the role of the Catholic Church as a driver of rational debate. It all supports a value of intellectual brotherhood.
But as critical readers, we have to apply discernment. We need to look at the narrative's limitations. What are some of the key biases we should look for?
Well, reviewers often point out that while he praises the role of Muslims and Jews, the narrative does tend to lean pretty heavily toward Latin Christianity.
So he might be underplaying the independent, vibrant, rational traditions within Judaism and Islam?
It's a valid critique. He also uses what historians call a turning point model. It's rhetorically powerful, but it can be historically risky.
You mean it might exaggerate Aristotle's singular centrality?
It might. And it can understate the longer, more gradual continuities in medieval thought. Change is rarely that clean.
And the most crucial point for discernment.
It's that Rubenstein is so focused on the tragedy of the divorce that he tends to cast later figures like Martin Luther and Thomas Hobbes a bit too simply.
As the agents of separation, the villains.
Right. And that narrative choice risks overlooking their own incredibly complex, rational, and sophisticated engagements with the very ideas they were rejecting.
So the final analytical tool we want to offer you is this. The book is a stunning case study in how a historian uses storytelling, powerful framing metaphors like marriage and divorce, and selective heroes and villains to completely reshape public memory about a period.
And this teaches you to distinguish between raw information, who translated what text, and true understanding.
Which is analyzing why that synthesis of faith and reason rises and falls, and recognizing how those competing views of human rationality still inform our current debates on science, democracy, and pluralism.
Which leaves us with a final question. If the tensions between our modern secular and religious worldviews are truly rooted in this historical divorce, what kind of new philosophical partnership, what new synthesis would be needed today to restore that optimistic, rational view of human capability championed by the original Aristotelians?
That's the question we leave you to reflect on. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.